Hello, happy anniversary. It's 35 years since the first charter law passed here in Minnesota. I'm Ember Reichgott Junge, and I was the state senator who authored that law. And I am so thrilled to be able to share with you the origins 35 years ago because we can still learn from them. And thank you to Max, to Joey, and to the entire team for allowing this to take place. It's really something to celebrate, and all of you have been a huge part of it. And the reason I'm so excited is because you are the ones who have made it happen over 35 years. I love this mural. This mural is in Pembroke Pines, Florida. Look at that. The students of this middle school did this mural. Education is the movement from darkness to light. Isn't that the truth? Isn't that why we're all in this world together? And I thank you for your dedicated service for so many years to education and to chartering. We're going to talk today about the origins of chartering. And the first thing is, chartering is not a school. A lot of people think that, but it's a system redesign. And we're going to talk about that, but also your leadership to transform that system of education, leadership as an educator, leadership as an advocate, and leadership as messenger. All of that is critically important for chartering to succeed into the next 35 years. Let's start at the beginning. 1992, September the 7th, the very first charter school opened in St. Paul, Minnesota, City Academy. And there's Milo Cutter right there in the middle. She is still there working with the students. I'm going to talk about the origins of chartering as I wrote in my book in 2013, Zero Chance of Passage, the Pioneering Charter School Story. I'll just tell you where that title came from. My colleague in the House of Representatives, Representative Becky Kelso, who was hugely instrumental in the passage of the law, told me when I interviewed her years later for the book that she was really surprised that it passed. In fact, she said, I had zero confidence it would pass. So that's it, zero chance of passage. And here we are. And many thanks to Representative Becky Kelso for all she did. Now, the book is available on Amazon, but I don't have them anymore. Instead, I have an audiobook if you wish to get it. And it is at the National Charter Schools Founders Library, which is at charterlibrary.org. And you can purchase the audiobook, which I had the pleasure of recording. All right, back to the origins again here. Now, right after the book came out, about 2 years later, 2015 or so, I was speaking to a group in Toledo, Ohio. And I met this gentleman. His name is Nathaniel Bond. And he was a second grade or a second year teacher at the school. He was born in St. Paul, Minnesota on January 20th, 1991, 5 months before the law passed in Minnesota. Now, at that time, he was about 23. He today would be 35 years old. And the reason I put that in there is you can just see he is just a young man. And chartering is just a young strategy. It still is there. It's still growing. And he, by the way, is still teaching. Chartering for me was about a story of ordinary people like you and me taking an extraordinary stand for change. And chartering today, after 35 years, here it is. Now, it's in actually 45 states operating as charter schools. Now, 4 states here, you'll see, 3 of them don't have chartering, the 3 next to us, by the way, Nebraska and the Dakotas. Montana passed chartering, hasn't happened yet. And the same thing actually with Kentucky. They've passed it, but it hasn't happened yet. So technically 45 states have chartering today. But, that's been a lot in 35 years. So what does it look like today nationally? Over nearly 4 million students are now in charter schools each year, which is nearly 8% of all public school students in the United States. There's 8140 or 8,140 charter schools in the nation, 45 states, Washington, D.C., which is about 50-50, by the way, with traditionals, Guam, Puerto Rico, and even 10 in Alberta, Canada. 1 million names or more are on waiting lists. And in New York City alone, they have more names on waiting lists than they actually have seats available in the schools. We're still at 440 million in charter school program funds federally. They're working on getting that higher, but at least we have that. And 211 new schools opened around the country in the 23-24 school year. Like everybody else, things got slowed during the COVID. Now, notice the asterisk for all those data points. They are 23-24 school year is what the latest is from the National Alliance of Charter for Charter Public Schools. So where are they located? Okay. Urban, mainly urban. We've seen that nearly 60% are in urban communities around the nation. Suburban, nearly 30%. Not so much in rural. We got to do a little more in that that area so we can get more in our rural areas. Same thing in Minnesota. We just don't have many in rural Minnesota. And then the towns are about 5.4%. So what are the demographics? Well, fastest growing group in chartering around the country is the Hispanic group. 37.4% of all charter school students are Hispanic. Caucasian is 28%, Black and African American, nearly 24%, and the rest you can see. But overall, we've got a lot of students of color being served in our charter schools. And here's the comparison, the charters versus the district demographics. In charter schools around the nation, nearly 72% are students of color. That compares to 55% in the districts. Same thing with free and reduced price lunch students. Charters have a greater number of those as well, with 63% compared to 55%. So you can really see that chartering has truly served the underserved. And I am so proud of that. So let's go to the story. How did it happen way back in 1991 or even before? Well, there were 3 visionaries who really made it happen. And this one is my favorite, Rudy Perpich, Governor Rudy Perpich. He was a fellow Croatian, as I am. And he introduced something called open enrollment. And he wanted to see students be able to go to a district school in another district, not in their own neighborhood, because there was just no opportunity for them to have any choices. Why did he want to do that? Because when he came down from Hibbing, Minnesota, he put his students, his children in the St. Paul schools, but he didn't feel that they were as good as the Hibbing schools. And so he wanted to move them to another district. That's what motivated him. Well, he introduced open enrollment for the very first time in the entire country. And it was met with a firestorm of protests. Everybody was pushing up against it. It took a few years to pass. So you won't see Rudy Perpich's name anywhere in a charter school book, but he opened the door to chartering. Seriously, without him, without that notion of going to another district, it wouldn't have happened. And what happened there is once we opened the door to new choices, we had to have more choices to access. And we needed them in our neighborhoods where people could go to them so they didn't have to go on a bus across town. So open enrollment created the motivation to create more and different choices once you had the ability to move. Now, the second person who might be a bit of a surprise, the second visionary, is none other than Al Shanker, the president of the American Federation of Teachers at that time. He came to Minnesota for an Itasca seminar sponsored by the Minneapolis Foundation on Education Reform. And that followed the open enrollment passage. And he came down and talked about something called charter schools. Well, I attended that as the author of open enrollment, as did other legislators. But for me, it was the first time I ever heard the words charter schools. Came from Al Shanker, of all people. But here's the thing. Al Shanker believed in something a little different. He wanted teachers to be the professionals that they were and to be treated that way, where they would have decision-making power and autonomy, and that they could have the freedom to teach as they thought best. He wanted them to be treated as certified professionals. Well, that got into my brain because I'm a Democrat, I'm union endorsed, and I thought, I want that too. And so that was what kind of motivated my first thought about charter schools. But one thing I have to tell you that really stuck with me is that he said, you know, the districts can take their customers for granted. And that was so true. You move into a district, you had no other choice except maybe that little bit of open enrollment, and you had to go to that school. So they were taking their students for granted. No motivation to change. The third visionary group was called the Citizens League. The Citizens League was a community group that included leaders from business and education and labor and community and politics or whatever. And together they got hold of this idea of chartering and started to lay out a plan for it in the legislative kind of form. So my point with this is that chartering came from outside the political system. I've always said that for us as politicians, if we step back, remove the barriers, and let citizens take the lead, let's see what can happen, because many good things can happen. And this is one of those things where chartering is just that. Citizens take the lead, teachers take the lead. But chartering came from outside the political system, meaning it wasn't introduced by a governor. It wasn't introduced by a legislator. It was brought to me as a legislator by a group of community leaders. So why chartering? Why were they interested? Why was I and others interested? Chartering opens up the K-12 public education system by allowing groups other than local school districts to provide public education. So the point is here to create choices outside the current system to make the K-12 public system more responsive to the parents. Now, this is where we diverge from Al Shanker, because his notion of it was to give those choices and opportunities to the teachers inside the district and inside the collective bargaining agreement. But we realized that just wasn't really going to happen. And so that's why we had to go our different ways on that point. Why chartering? Well, remember I said it's about system redesign. Ted Koldery is the intellectual person who really created this idea. We all know Ted. And he has this notion of innovation, that innovation is letting people try things, giving them the space to try things. And chartering creates space where different can be tried. Because if you're in the traditional district, they've got all the rules and regs and, oh, we can't do that. We've never done that before. But we have to have the space to try something different. And so system redesign allows schools to be created new, not within a district school or in another school, but to create a whole new school. And that's why chartering is a system redesign and is not a school, is not a school. The public does not understand that, that is for sure. There it is, chartering, not a school. Now, we had to make a bargain in order to make that happen and give that autonomy and independence to those teacher leaders and others. And here's the bargain. In return for independence, charter school leaders had to commit to accountability in their performance contract. They have to live up to their performance commitments or the school may be closed. Now, this is not the case in traditional district schools. Rarely was a school closed for basis of performance, and this was brand new. And yes, charter schools have been closed when they haven't performed. So I like to say that charter schools trade regulation for results, bureaucracy for accountability. back to the story. Where were we in 1991 when the bill finally passed? Well, here's where we were. It wasn't very easy to pass, believe me. There was opposition from everywhere, which I talk about in my book. Well, first of all, the powerful teacher unions were not excited about this at all, as you can imagine. Now, remember, we are a Democratic farmer labor majority in the state House and Senate. Democrats are in the majority. We normally are aligned with the teachers union, so that was a problem. And of course, the Republican governor, normally Republicans have been usually pretty open to this, but you have to understand that Governor Arne Carlson had just come in and defeated the former governor, Rudy Perpich, right? And why? One reason was because Rudy Perpich had introduced open enrollment and the teachers didn't like that. And so they actually endorsed the Republican candidate, Arne Carlson. This was the climate where we introduced our legislation. Becky Kelso and me, both Democrats, introduced the legislation in 1991 into the Minnesota legislature. Oh, the journey. It was rough. And in the end, as you see here, chartering passed by only 3 votes on the critical vote in the House. It passed really for 2 reasons. One was it brought together the middle. We don't see that anymore. And when you look at the numbers, 42% of the majority Democrats voted for it, but 56% of the minority Republicans voted for it. And that combined to make that 3-vote difference. Now you say, wait a minute, you mean something passed without a majority of the majority party, the Democrats, in favor of it? And that is true. That is true. And that is something that absolutely doesn't happen today. And because of that, I put the blue on the elephant and the red on the donkey, because it was kind of switched. It was amazing how that happened. There's a second, well, part of the reason that passed now in that 3-vote margin is because in the House at that time where the 3-vote margin took place was this speaker, Robert Vanasek. He is the true hero, unsung hero nobody knows about, but I wrote about it in the book because it was so new to me. How did it happen to pass by just 3 votes? Well, you have to understand, nobody knew where the Speaker of the House was on this bill. I mean, Democrats were split all over the place. But when the vote comes up on the board and people are actually voting, he's the only one who can see what the vote cumulative total is. Now you have to understand, I'm sitting in my Senate office watching their board, and when the vote goes up, I just see a whole bunch of red. That means there's a lot of no votes on this very critical vote. He held the vote open for a while, and other people were coming up and changing their votes and out. And then all of a sudden, he got his gavel and he said, "The secretary will close the roll." And I just covered my eyes because I just thought it went down. But it didn't. It passed by 3 votes. And I was just like beyond myself. I couldn't believe it. Well, I found out years later, that he was the hero. Why? Because he can close the roll whenever he wants to. That's the power of the speaker. He closed it when it was 3 votes ahead. But guess what? 10 members of the House had not voted yet. 10 Democrats. Now, you say, well, he can't do that. They have the right to vote. Well, they had every right to vote. They chose not to. Why? Because he knew, and they knew, they wanted to stay off the board because they didn't want to aggravate the unions. So that's how it passed. And nobody really knows that in the end, if that speaker hadn't been there, it probably never would have passed. Now, the second reason that it passed is that it was severely compromised. When I saw what happened to that bill, I was in tears. I thought a charter school would never, ever happen. And the reason is that it required not only approval by a district, which of course didn't love these at all, but approval by the state as well. The state board and the district had to approve the charter school. I thought this is never going to happen. But we had to make a choice. Do we go ahead with this and give it a try or not? Well, as I realized very, very shortly after that, it would never have passed without compromise. Becky Kelso, my House member colleague, thought it was spectacular that it passed in any form. And so what I learned was a big lesson, and that compromise is not defeat. Actually, compromise is the only way it passed. Because just 2 days after it passed, these two national figures picked it up, to my great surprise. On the left here is Republican U.S. Senator Dave Durenberger, Minnesota U.S. Senator. And he had worked with the Citizens League. He loved this idea. So he grabbed it and he talked about how important this was on the Senate floor. Can you imagine my surprise about that? Here he is saying, this is passed in Minnesota. And he was actually talking to his colleagues about it. On the right, there's another guy here that you all know, who was the Arkansas governor at the time, Bill Clinton. Well, he was actually the head of something called the Democratic Leadership Council, which was an organization of basically pragmatic Democrats who really just wanted to solve problems. Well, they decided that chartering was something that we needed for education and that it really fell right in the middle, because the two of them realized that this was just a pragmatic alternative that went right down the middle. At that time, President George H.W. Bush was really focused on private school vouchers. The House Democrats in Congress were really focused on the status quo. We don't need to change anything. Well, chartering went right through the middle, and that's where Clinton and Durenberger were. The impact of these two national figures cannot be underestimated. Durenberger in the United States Senate, and he, by the way, aligned with Ted Kennedy on the issue, and Bill Clinton, who not only became the president and was a supporter of chartering, but even during the time it was trying to pass in Minnesota, was already talking about it as he was meeting with people in his role as chair of the Democratic Leadership Council. So these two very, very influential people were already taking chartering to the nation. But meanwhile, back at home, the local school boards just didn't see it the same way. So the first 9 applications came through to local districts. Remember, it has to be approved by districts and the state. And 7 of them were rejected by the school boards. Only 2 of them actually survived. I mean, it was like the fox guarding the chickens. They didn't want this competition in their backyard or anywhere. So no, they weren't approving it. But 2 did survive, and one is City Academy, which we talked about earlier, which actually was a school that was enrolling people who had otherwise dropped out of high school. So that wasn't nearly as threatening to the city of St. Paul. This was a good thing to bring them back to education. And in the year 2000, which was about 9 years after the law passed, Bill Clinton came to City Academy to celebrate the passage of the law and his goal of having 3,000 charter schools by the end of his term. The other one that survived the process of authorization was the Metro Deaf School, obviously a special needs school that, again, didn't affect the majority of students. So what we want to do now, after the origin, is how can you use your leadership in chartering? And I think that's really critically important. We've got this foundation around the country, but you have the ability as educators and parents and families to get it to a place where more will understand it, more will want to use it, more will want to see this opportunity for chartering to grow and galvanize. 3 ways you as leaders can make this happen. First is you can be innovators. Yes, it's already happening. There have been many, many innovations from chartering educators. My favorite is teacher-powered schools, which happened right here in Minnesota. This is where it began. Henderson schools and the New Country School with their teacher-powered school was kind of one of the first where teachers really did have the ability to lead, to create, to manage their budget in the way they thought best. Really, what Al Shanker wanted them to do. So I love teacher-powered schools. We had in Minnesota the first union-initiated authorizer, where union leaders actually were authorizing some teacher-powered in other schools. Sadly, that one is going to be dissolving soon, but they sure had a great history here in supporting chartering in Minnesota. Oh, I love the innovations of personalized child-centered learning. And then this concept of accountability is interesting. Remember I said that this was something that held schools accountable for performance or they'd be closed. District schools didn't used to do that, but they started to do that after this came about through chartering. So that data that they used for accountability for performance was not just used to close schools, and that's what I love about it too. It was used to inform instruction, to share best practices, to change bad practices. And so the use of data started flowing, if you will, more after chartering became a thing. Now, the next one we all know is just a headache. There are myths out there, and you need to be an advocate to change these myths. We have been tearing our hair out for 35 years because some of the myths I'm going to talk about right now actually existed when I tried to get the law passed in 1991. And who could believe that they'd still be here? But it's true. So let's challenge the myths. All right. First, oh, this is a big one. Charter schools get more money than other public schools or district schools. And that's certainly a myth. You all know that firsthand. Nationally, charter schools receive only about 77% of funding per pupil than neighboring district schools. And for us, that comes from the lack of property taxes for facilities. But across the country, this is absolutely a fact. That, by the way, that 77% of funding means that's an average of $4,300 less per pupil than the district student. Now, you've really got to do more with less. Okay, this one. Charter schools take money from district schools. I hear this all the time. I still hear it all the time. And you and I both know that public money follows the student to the charter school, and every child deserves a full and excellent education. You know, it's hard to believe. You know, if a student leaves the Minneapolis school district to go to the Eden Prairie school district, let's say, you know, the money follows the student. Nobody even thinks about it twice. Of course, Minneapolis loses that money and it goes to Eden Prairie. Well, if a student leaves Minneapolis schools to go to, let's say, Friendship Charter School nearby, 2 miles away, it's still a public school. The money follows the student. There's no difference. And in fact, not all the money follows the student. Only 77% on average follows the student across the country. So it just doesn't make any sense. And people need to realize that the money follows the student. This is the biggest myth that we are up against right now, that somehow charter schools are private schools. Oh, you know that charter schools are public schools. They were absolutely public schools by law. Every one of the 45 state laws make them, or yeah, make them 48 state laws, make them charters public schools. But people don't realize it. And part of it is a language issue. So one thing I have used over years to try to make a difference is I say charter public schools and district public schools. We get the word district in there, or traditional public schools. You know what I absolutely hate? I hear it on the radio and the television all the time. And they'll say, like, Yep, on September X, whatever, the schools opened in Minneapolis. The public schools opened and the charter schools opened. Huh? What does that tell you? That charters are something other than public. And that I hear all the time, the public schools and the charter schools. But when I say charter public schools and district public schools, people get it. And a lot of times parents will say, what did you say? They're public schools, and that starts a good conversation. This issue I'm going to come back to very, very soon because it's being litigated across the country right now and has been up in the United States Supreme Court, and that is a very serious issue. The myth, charter schools don't perform. Well, you all know that they do. Here's a couple things that I particularly like. There's a number of studies, you've seen them, but what I like here is that charter students from low-income families graduate from college at much higher rates than their peers in nearby district schools. I like that. And I like that the closer a charter school is located to a district school, the better the traditional students will perform academically. Charter schools have an impact not just for their students, but for the community around them. They help to raise all boats. They really do. So what kinds of schools are charter schools? Well, 56% across the nation are freestanding charter schools. In Minnesota, most of ours are this. 31% are led by a large nonprofit network. That would be like a KIPP school. And then about 17% are operated by for-profit networks called education management organizations. We don't have the for-profit networks here in Minnesota. But I do want to make the point here that even though there might be a for-profit network, charter schools are still nonprofit entities. They are led by boards just like nonprofits. And so in the end, the nonprofit board chooses who they hire and how they want to operate the school. So we've talked a lot about advocating, pushing back against those myths, helping policymakers, parents, and the community to understand what chartering is and what it is not. But how do you message? And what's our positive message? We got to have a positive message too, right? So a few years ago, there was a focus group and research study by Frank Luntz, who is a Republican pollster, I believe. But what he did was determine the best messages for us to have for expressing what chartering is. And what he found from the focus groups are these three messages: freedom to choose, which is actually the conservative message; equality for every child, which is the more liberal message; and the efficient, accountable use of tax dollars, which is a message for everyone. But the number one message, the number one positive message about chartering is it creates opportunity. New opportunities for children and youth, opportunities that they might not have in their own neighborhood. And it's all about public school choice and opportunity. So Frank Luntz was the one who created this a number of years ago. And the Founders Library, which I'll talk about shortly, has a wonderful messaging toolkit there, which we created for the 30th anniversary of chartering. So you can check that out. Now, how do you use messaging? Well, you want to make sure that you get a message that has the values in it that people relate to. So if you want to say you provide an effective education, you want to say, hey, we provide an effective education. And what do we do with that? We prepare students for success in college, career, and life. That's a way to get that message to resonate. And then you go to telling a story, your story about Maria or your student, and you talk about that story basically in 2 minutes or less. Don't ever go more than 2 minutes. And in your story, you want to just talk about where it started, where Maria started. She was behind by 2 years in her work or in her test scores. She came in, this is what our school did, and she now is graduating with honors. So 1, 2, 3 stories are effective. Speaking of stories, that's why I co-founded in 2017 the National Charter Schools Founders Library. This is where the audio book is for Zero Chance of Passage, because I donated the book to the library for the future so that all proceeds will go to them. And what the Founders Library does is capture the history so we can inform the future. So you can check that out at charterlibrary.org. Now, why did we start a library? Why was it so important? Well, because back in 2016, when I was trying to figure out how people could research chartering, do you realize that there was just nothing in the Minnesota Historical Society about chartering? I mean, it didn't even come up. Why? Because even though I had put all of my past documents about it into the library, the Historical Society, see that box? That's where they are. Nobody could get to it. They didn't know it was there. Look at where the box was. This is where all the origin documents of chartering were, on the 16th shelf of that. And you'd have to get a little truck and go up and get the box down, take it out. Nobody's going to do that. And we realized that in 2016 that nobody could access these documents that were so important in the history. And I put them here after the conclusion of the book so that others could use them for history. Well, anyway, that's why we decided to create the Founders Library and make it digital. And we started putting all the documents digitally from my work, from Ted Coldery's work, from Minnesota, and now from many states around the country. And the use of the library, we hope, will be for several things, and that is to challenge the relentless misuse of the language and the origins and purposes of chartering, to create a common conversation between the district and charter sectors. In other words, as we go into 21st century education, what can we learn from each other? It's important. Create a fact-based conversation. There is so much out there, as you know, finger pointing and mistruths. It's fact-based. And that's why this toolkit is available again on the 30th anniversary site at charterlibrary.org. Now, we do have a challenge, a big challenge ahead of us right now. And ironically, the library has been a big part of it. Many of you are aware of the Oklahoma case that came up to the U.S. Supreme Court back in 2025. I actually was an amicus party to that and created a brief with 2 governors and 7 other lawmakers that we submitted, telling the court that yes, chartering is public. They are public schools and therefore should not be allowed to teach religion. You probably remember that the Oklahoma case wanted to have a charter school teach religion. That went all the way up to the Supreme Court. The court split 4-4, keeping the status quo, saying, nope, can't teach religion. But as you can see, one of the justices recused herself, Amy Coney Barrett, and that was just because of a specific connection in that case. The challenge for us is 2 more cases are on the way. Now, there's a couple of issues here that really are concerning, especially because the next cases are on their way. The first issue, are charter schools public enough in the underlying statute? Obviously, we're working with the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools about all of this. But each state has to determine if their law is public enough. For example, Michigan's law says charter schools are public. They say that. Not sure if Minnesota law does. I don't think so, but maybe we should make that change. And the whole bigger issue is separation of church and state at risk. It really is, because there are 4 justices, I was in that courtroom, that really believe that it is constitutional to teach religion in public schools. And so we need to really be watching this. And you know what? There is no issue that brings people together more than this one. The district schools, the teachers' unions, the school boards, the chartering community, we all work together on this case saying, hey, charter schools are public schools. We're going to see more of that in the future. And that's probably one of the reasons why I have stayed engaged over these years to protect the origins of chartering. Well, before I sign off here, we've talked about leadership as an educator who's going to innovate. We've talked about leadership as an advocate and as a messenger. But this last slide here, I just want to share a story of a leader who led from her chair. Oh, I'm so inspired by her. I heard her talk. Her name is Antoinette Tuft, and she wrote a book herself. She's a receptionist who was working at the front desk of an Atlanta district school. And one day, a man came in carrying an A-47 rifle. And she knew that they were in trouble. And so she tried to stay calm. And she knew the person, apparently, and started talking with him. Well, first of all, she buzzed the buzzer or whatever to alert people. And then she talked to him and talked to him and just said, why are you here? What do you want to do? And she just wanted to pay attention to him. And sure enough, she was able to get the man to go into a room to sit down and talk, rifle in hand. Imagine that, putting her own life at risk so that when they got her in the room, they could barricade off the rest of the school and protect the students. She led from her chair. And she, by the way, wasn't even the full-time receptionist. She worked in the back office in the accounting area, and she was just covering for the receptionist. You can lead from your chair. Every one of us can do that. And many, many of you in the chartering community are doing that and making a huge difference. So I thank all of you for being charter school pioneers. I am grateful. 35 years of success in Minnesota and beyond. You were the beginning. And I can't believe that 35 years later, I'm still here to talk about it, but many of you are too. And let's just make sure that our legacy lives on in a successful way. And I thank MACS, Minnesota Association for Charter Schools, very much for this and for connecting this up to the Founders Library on your website so that everyone can have access to all these materials for our future. Thank you very much, and I wish you all the success. You are amazing.